You are at Rand Anderson, because it's center framed, like Wes Anderson. I don't know. This is where for $5 I will rant about a topic of your choice. Click the link in the description to request a rant. This one comes from Speckobst. Rants about scoring systems in 3D action games. I like this question a lot because it contains an inherent conflict. Scoring systems, in my opinion, in my mind, are very synonymous with arcades, and 3D action and arcades, that's never really been a thing within the same game. The only game that I can think of that does suit that is Spike Out. And Spike Out, it's a beat 'em up, 3D beat 'em up by Sega, and it does sort of maintain a lot of the classic arcade tropes. It's constant, uninterrupted action. There's a timer pushing you forward. I think if you don't have those elements, like in a shmup, for example, where it's just scripted to constantly move forward, or you have some kind of timer that fulfills that purpose, it's already very hard to justify having a big old score in the corner of the screen because you want every action to sort of matter toward the score, right? And ideally, like, you get time bonuses, health bonuses, that type of shit. You see that transition even already on the NES before 3D action, with the shift from games to the first Super Mario Brothers to Mario 3, where obviously you got much more exploratory. The score mattered less and less. The live system mattered less and less. So I think the last big budget home console game that I can think of that was constant action and was very suited to a traditional scoring system was something like Sin and Punishment 2 on the Wii back in 2009. And from what I'm told, that game's scoring, and it's not like really a 3D action game either, so that's the whole thing. But from what I'm told, that game does not have a great scoring system. That game's scoring system seems like kind of busted and not bad and not very good. So this is the core tension that 3D action games that are interested in having some kind of scoring system deal with. I think it's also the fact that what is even the purpose of a scoring system in the home, right? That is sort of suspect. In an arcade setting, it makes very natural sense, even just as a way to track your progress without necessarily having to finish the game, which I would argue is not a very realistic way to engage in that setting. It's probably not what you're trying to do when you're there with your friends and you're probably drunk as fuck. So what the fuck, right? It takes a developer like Hideki Kamiya making the original DMC, who is just very naturally passionate about the arcade experience, the arcade setting, to even try to resolve that tension somehow. Now, Boghog, Indie Dev, and Opinion Haver, Boghog, very active on Twitter, on his blog. You should follow him. This is very great stuff. He did an article recently on the evolution of 3D action, and he talked about DMC a little bit. And one thing he mentioned is that letter grades as a way to, let's say, embellish scoring were insanely common during this era, even in stuff like like the Resident Evil games. I think Matthew Matosis has also talked about this, where this is another thing, right? The home console games, especially in that period, at the start of 3D action, were in this very awkward spot of, okay, you didn't have local competition, but you also didn't have online leaderboards, right? So you needed something to compare yourself against, and that's where a letter grading system kind of makes sense. You get this extra layer of depth kind of suggested by the developers. Okay, if you want to take the game seriously, you should pay attention to this. In the case of DMC, it does the letter grading, but and then it also does the real time scoring, sort of like in a fighting game. Again, this is something that Boghog talks about in the article, where if you wail on a guy, it tracks the number of hits in that short combo window and scores you based on that. That's actually not a completely new mechanic. It's pretty much the same thing as the combo hit tracking in an old fighting game like MVC2 or even Third Strike. And even in those games, they wouldn't just track the number of hits, right? They had some kind of conception of what a long or what a good combo is. In Third Strike, it's like the I think the number of hits are not displayed in real time. You get the calculation when the combo is over, and then it's also evaluated. It also tells you, okay, this was an awesome combo. I do think the way DMC leverages that in the context of a single player game was novel and was very clever, and that is cool. But it doesn't coalesce into a great scoring system because guess what? The game still wants you to just get to the end of the level very fast, and that is the most important thing. And like most of the shit you do on the way there is not super important as long as you're not getting hit too much. So what the fuck, right? Now obviously we have that whole lineage. Kamiya would continue to develop his methodology for scoring. And I think that eventually the way the genre kind of settled on resolving, again, this tension is by just choosing the one thing that is actually relevant to the mechanic, that should be relevant to scoring, which is combat, and just completely isolating it from the rest of the game, right? And you see this very clearly in Beautiful Joe already, but that's obviously not a 3D game, really. Um, Obviously, the one y'all want me to talk about is Bayonetta. Bayonetta feels sort of like the final form of this design methodology, where it has the individual verses that are the one sole thing you're graded by. If you take damage outside of the verses, it doesn't matter. It's not going to count toward your score or toward your end of level grade. So you can just focus on the combat, and you don't have to. The designers didn't have to account for all the exploratory ambitions that they had. Right? They could stuff the levels with as much shit that they wanted. So I think generally that is something I'm very okay with, and that is something that's pretty smart. And I think Bayonetta is a streamlined enough game, especially with something like Beast Within, where if you want to go for pure platinum everything, you're not really fucking around doing not arcadey things too much. You kind of are just playing the video game for the most part. I can say this with, I mean, I'm not a scoring arcade game expert by any means, but I can say this with some amount of confidence because I'm personally almost at the end of my pure platinum highest difficulty attempt or run of Bayonetta. Literally just have one level to go, and I thought it was a pretty pleasant experience overall. Now, as far as the combat itself goes, again, this is another thing that Boghog has mentioned. 3D games, they naturally have an inherent level of complexity that is just not there in 2D. And on the one hand, that is cool, that is worth praising, but then also, and again, this is something he mentioned, it allows for shit to just slip through the cracks. And that's not great in a game that's about competition, right? You don't want it to be so augmented and exploitable that it becomes meaningless. And unfortunately, that if we can dig into it, but I think if you're just taking the actual scoring combo mechanics of Bayonetta in isolation, it's just way too flawed to take seriously. If we're looking at it in the context of what the developers overall designed, where they average out, they have 3 categories in combat: combo / score, damage, and time, and each one just has a threshold where, okay, this is the grade that you get, or has a set of thresholds, I should say. And I think for the type of game that Bayonetta is, that kind of makes sense. because they're trying to balance the idea of, okay, we want to give you some kind of formal rule set to abide by. We want you to care about how you play the game a little bit, but we also um don't want to curb the fuck around nature of the game too much. Because again, from DMC onward, that is something the genre very much trended toward, right? The I think most of these games very much at least lend themselves to fucking around with them, to toying with the enemies, to expressing yourself, player expression, that whole buzzword. And I think making a scoring system that doesn't somehow still allow that appeal to flourish could be considered a failure, right? So that's what they're trying to balance. And I think in Bayonetta's case, personally speaking, I think it sort of makes sense. I don't think they do a terrible job. I think the game is better for having the scoring system that it does versus not having it. Not saying couldn't be better. I guess one of the first things that is interesting is just separating the categories in the first place instead of like in a traditional arcade game. What they would have done is they they would have just let a timer run, and then depending on how fast you do it, you get a time bonus. The remaining time is added to your score as a bonus, and then depending on the game, that matters more or less, I guess. Bayonetta is not how it works. You basically, the way you should look at it is, okay, you have a window where the platinum score for a time is possible, and you want to use as much of that window to score as much as possible. And I think, in my opinion, that matches the character of the game and the sort of design goals of the game the best. That seems to me like the correct way to design it. Um, Now the scoring itself also ties into that because the designers seemed very aware of the fact that, okay, you have some very powerful tools that in isolation, if I just spam them over and over in a timing focused game, right, like the first DMC, or even, I mean, something like DMC3, right? It is mostly tracking damage in a short window of time, and if you played that with Bayonetta's mechanics, I mean, DMC3 itself is already like pretty busted game in terms of its scoring, in terms of its real time ranking. But then with Bayonetta's mechanics, it would just be over. So I think coupling um the way Bayonetta's mechanics work with the score and with the timer is pretty interesting. And what they did basically is they went in and assigned a fixed value to every single attack individually. And what you'll realize is that the value of each attack is not proportional to its damage. At least not directly proportional. So a regular punch will do 10 points, and a Wicked Weave, which is much stronger, will give like 30 points. So yes, the Wicked Weave does give more points, but it's not proportional to the damage. If I can get many more punches in the same amount of time, or in the same amount of damage, and get a higher score. So you can't. So on the one hand, you can simply spam the strongest moves and then still expect to get a platinum score. But then also, you still have the timer to worry about. So strong moves still have some kind of purpose, right? And because, again, the score at the end is averaged out anyway, right? It's averaged to the platinum threshold if you reach it. So if you're abiding by the game's design, there's no reason to get the highest score possible. You just want to reach the threshold. And I think generally speaking, that is pretty smart and that does make sense. They also have this interesting mechanic where if you use the same move twice without having a Wicked Weave in between, you initiate a score decay. your score will be, for that specific attack, will be lowered. And it can go all the way to that attack only scoring a single point. And you could be saying, okay, well, it's like pretty easy to just then throw out a Wicked Weave to reset the score. But then because the Wicked Weave does damage, and it does, disproportionately higher damage to what you want to score with, that is not a good thing to do, right? That is still, you still fucked up, and like it still might hurt you. So when I lay it out all like that, that sounds like a pretty good scoring system. However, and see, Bockhawk has sort of thrown around the idea of reviewing Bayonetta's scoring system. I want him to do this so bad. I want him to just completely bully me and just convince me that it's shit. I think this would be a great service to society, because I'm still relatively a defender of Bayonetta's overall scoring system, but I can recognize where it's very flawed. And I think the main thing is like a very low hanging fruit issue where they they're not transparent about the thresholds for each category. I mean, with damage, it's whatever, right? Damage, just don't get hit. Okay, but they don't show you how much time you're allowed to use and still get a platinum, and they don't show you at which threshold you get a platinum combo. And I think that's bad, because the game trends toward being very lenient on both of those fronts. And I think it had they just made that shit transparent, had they just showed you the amount of time that you're allowed to use to get a platinum score, they could have just tightened that shit up. They could have tightened that shit way up, and I think would have made for a much more interesting game. Because as it is now, like I'm putting a lot of effort into not abusing weapons, and like not using, not dropping my combos, and just not taking too long either. But in the back of my mind, I know, yeah, I kind of don't have to. I could probably just fuck around and still get a really good score. Now, you're discouraged from doing this as well, because the game, the game only tracks level progress holistically. So in Bayonetta 3, they added this thing where you can update the score on individual verses, where it will always just save your best score, right? And I think that is a good way to do it. In Bayonetta 1, that's not the case. You have to do the entire level in one chunk. And you can, it's stupid because you can still restart checkpoints, right? So it's not a genuine single attempt, single run anyway. I don't know, it's like it's very feasible that you will lose an entire hour of progress and then you have to do the whole shit again. I just don't know if that really matches the other goals of the game. I can sort of understand why. God, I'm going so long. Why they opted not to show you the thresholds for the platinum scores or whatever while you're playing, because they already get so much pushback for the scoring system. They already get so much pushback from casual players that it's discouraging, that it's disheartening, that it's that they just don't like getting negative feedback. So if you then added the pressure of like, oh my god, there's a timer ticking down, and then if I don't match the timer, then I'm just garbage. I sort of get that, but then there would have been ways around it. You could have done the thing where you make it accessible from the second playthrough onward, or you could have done the thing where in Ninja Gaiden, for example, you press a button and then it shows the timer, and then it shows your combo. I actually think that would have been the best solution. Yeah, there's nothing that would have. I think that would have been perfect, and then again, they could have tightened that shit way up. There's just generally some exploits in the game that I would prefer not to be there. I don't really mind the angel weapons being as powerful as they are, because I think the conscious decision of, okay, I'm gonna build up magic and then I'm gonna go for this guy and I'm gonna get his weapon and that's gonna give me a shit ton of points, and then I still ideally I want to crowd the enemies together and all that stuff. I think that is enjoyable. It's not the deepest thing in the world, but I do think it still matches the overall game very well. Yeah, I want to say Bayonetta 1 is the best we got on that front. In Bayonetta 2, they did the genius thing of making damage and score completely proportional. So you're literally just speed killing everything. There's no reason not to just use the strongest shit you have constantly. And I think that makes for a much drier, much less interesting game if you're trying to score in it. I think the game in general is just designed in a way where that's encouraged, right? The enemies are just so obnoxious that they very much incentivize the use of very specific weapons. Um, I don't know. I think Bayonetta 1, for as flawed as it is, the the scoring and the grading to me just matches the character. I've said this like a billion times now, but it matches the character of the game very well. I feel like it lines up with the game's overall design goals. And personally, I do have fun trying to go for a high score instead of just surviving, or instead of just fucking around. So yeah, I feel like I could have done maybe a more consolidated, more streamlined take on this. Like the idea of this segment was not that I go on for 20 minutes, but like this was just way too fun, complicated of a topic. So yeah, hope y'all enjoyed.